afternoon, Hartford, and welcome once again to another episode of Voices of Veterans here done at Hartford Cable Access Television on Channel 5 and 96. We're so happy that we're able to have the access to this resource to bring some information to you and to also bring some ideas and thoughts to you, and also to bring the voices of other veterans out here to educate the American public about what happens during war and what it actually does to us. Today is June 5th, 2018, and last week was Memorial Day, celebrated on Monday, though it's not really a celebration, it's more of a remembrance of those men and women who've given their lives over many hundreds of years in the conflicts that the United States has waged here and across the world. And so today we're going to be listening to I'm going to be reading to you some voices of veterans other than United States veterans. Because as I was watching the news this past weekend, I saw an individual who came on the CNN and the news stations who had been attempted to be assassinated. It was an assassination attempt against this individual in the Ukraine that was fomented by the Russian Secret Service, and they ran a sting operation in which they tricked the FSB security forces of Russia, thinking they had killed this individual whose name was Arkady Babchenko, who was a Ukrainian journalist who was also the author of a book. And I had been struck by the familiarity of his name, and I was like, I've heard that name before, Arkady Babchenko. I kept trying to remember where I heard it, and then I realized that this man who had survived an assassination attempt was a Russian veteran of the two wars in Chechnya, waged by the Russians against the Islamic republics of Chechnya and Ossetia, which is in the Caucasus Mountains. So Arkady Babchenko wrote this book of his experience in the wars in Chechnya. It's called One Soldier's War, and it's written by, he is now a journalist, and apparently he's fled to the Ukraine because of the attempt on his life. But what I really want to bring to your attention is the history of what's been going on in Russia, which has been very similar for their veterans as it has with us. When they were in Afghanistan from 1978 to 1988, the United States had already withdrawn from Vietnam. And some of us Vietnam veterans, as we watched this war in Afghanistan grow larger and larger and saw more Soviet troops committed and read the accounts of what was happening over there, some of us realized and said to ourselves that this was going to be the Soviet Union's Vietnam. And sure enough, that's how it turned out. After 10 years of struggling against the Mujahideen and the resistance forces in Afghanistan, the Soviets left. They demobilized their troops, and they left Afghanistan on February 15th in 1988. And thereafter, the country fell apart into various warlord sections fighting amongst themselves. And this was also when the Taliban came into existence and exerted control over the country of Afghanistan. And then after 9/11 happened, the United States started invaded the country of Afghanistan, which really is composed of 4 or 5 different ethnic groups. It's not really a country of Afghanistan. It's made up of the Pashtuns, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Hazara, and numerous other groups of people that live in that area. So since 2001, the United States has been involved in Afghanistan. And I never thought that we would make that same mistake all over again. But now we are engaged in a guerrilla war in Afghanistan against the indigenous people. Arkady Babchenko wrote his book about the wars that Russia is waging in Chechnya, which is in the Caucasus Mountains. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from his book so you can get an idea of what Russian veterans are going through. And it seems to me that the similarities are incredible between what's happened to them and what's happened to us. It would be wrong to think that the war in Chechnya began the day that the Federal Army was brought in. And there was certainly more than one motivation behind it. Chechnya is a complex tangle of factors and accidents. a whirlwind of events that the future historians will have difficulty sorting out. The Chechnya conflict started in the early 1990s, soon after General Zokhar Dudiev came to power. He had been a pilot in the Soviet Air Force and fought in the Soviet-Afghan War. From the outset, he followed the policy of political independence for Chechnya and ultimately declared its cession from the Russian Federation. In 1991, Dudiev expelled the Russian army forces from the territory of Chechnya. When the army withdrew, a huge amount of ammunition was left behind. That's similar to what happened in Vietnam. More than 200 airplanes were abandoned in the airport of Grozny alone, together with tanks, armored carriers, artillery, and even several Grad rocket launchers. The amount of weaponry was simply astounding. Whole ammunition depots, tens of thousands of units were simply left behind. Lawlessness and chaos set in after Dudiev had announced a 100% amnesty for all criminals, without exception, which led to a huge influx into Chechnya of all kinds of people who were in trouble with the law. The immediate result was an outbreak of banditry, and before long murder and robbery had become commonplace. More often than not, non-Chechens were the victims. A wave of Russian refugees flooded into Russia from Chechnya. It would be wrong to say that the genocide of the non-Chechen population was a state policy, but Chechens, whose society is based on a system of clans known as taips, were certainly better protected. Chechnya's current president, Ramzan Kadyrov, belongs to the Benoi taip, for example. Since Russians have no taip system, they found themselves completely defenseless. No one was going to avenge their deaths, and this made them easy prey. Growing gangsterism and unemployment undermined Dudiev's authority and caused a split among the population. This conflict was exacerbated by the fierce struggle for domination going on among the taips. In November of 1994, pro-Moscow opposition forces, led by Umar Avturkanov, stormed Grozny and were defeated. 20 Russian tanks were destroyed with their crews, and the few surviving tank men were captured. Moscow renounced them. President Boris Yeltsin, a despotic ruler, couldn't have cared less about individuals, and he was infuriated that General Dudiev had acted beyond his authority. In my opinion, this was the real reason federal forces were sent into Chechnya. The military operation to overthrow the Dudiev regime was launched on 11 December 1994. It was poorly planned. Recall the then Minister of Defense, General Grakyev's announcement that he would capture Grozny with 2 regiments in 2 hours. From the outset, the army was betrayed by the high command. Its soldiers were insufficiently trained, depressed and demoralized. They did not understand the aims of this war, and they were treated as cannon fodder. That December in Grozny, the Russian army bore huge losses. On New Year's Eve, the 131st Maikop Brigade was almost completely wiped out. Various other units approaching the city from different directions were blocked and partially destroyed. People were killed in their thousands. To this day, there are no official statistics for casualties in the first Chechnya campaign. Under the current Russian government, we'll never know anyway, because they are catastrophic. But according to unofficial information, in January alone, almost 5,000 Russian officers and soldiers were killed in the Battle of Grozny. The Chechen losses, not to mention the deaths among the civilian populations, are not known and probably never will be. No one counted them at all. I was drafted into the Army as a second-year law student in November of 1995, a year after the war began. I spent 6 months in a training unit in the Urals, and in May of 1996, I was transported to the northern Caucasus together with 1,500 other conscripts. First, I served at the frontline town of Mozdok on the border with Chechnya, and then in Chechnya itself. Officially, a truce had been signed by them, but shooting was going on all the time. This period is described in the chapter The Runway, Mozdok 7, and the summer of 1996. On 6 August of 1996, Chechen fighters captured Grozny and held the city for 2 weeks. This was the second heaviest battle, and it ended in yet another truce and the signing of the Khasavyurt Accords, by which Chechnya practically received independence within the Russian Federation. In late August, my father died, and I was given leave. I barely made it to the funeral. That same day, I fell ill with dysentery and was taken to the hospital in an ambulance. My leave expired before I was released from the hospital, and when I reported to the Army authorities, I was arrested as a deserter. I spent 3 months in a penal battalion. Because of an absence of incriminating material, as if it were not clear from the start, the case was closed. After Dudiyev's death in April of 1996, Aslan Mashkadov was elected president of Chechnya. Mashkadov was a reasonable and even-tempered man and had been chief of GHQ under Dudiyev, but his position was not secure. His army consisted of only 2,000 men, and he was therefore powerless as president. In reality, Chechnya was controlled by field commanders of fighter units such as Ruslan Gelayev, Shamil Busarev, Arbi Bariev, and the Jordanian Khattab, to name but a few. Lawlessness reigned supreme, and the people were kidnapped all the time. In the People's Friendship Square in the center of Grozny, there was a flourishing and perfectly open slave trade. According to official data, during the 3 years of Chechnya's independence, almost 30,000 people were kidnapped and sold into slavery or executed in Chechnya. After the demobilization, I completed the remaining 2 years at the Law Institute and graduated with a bachelor's degree. It was the autumn of 1999, and the second Chechen campaign was just beginning. This time, I volunteered to take part in the war. There were many thousands of us, ex-soldiers, who returned to that second war after the first. I have no answer as to why I went there again. I don't know. I just couldn't help it. I was irresistibly drawn back there. Maybe it was because of my past was there, a large part of my life. It was as if only my body had returned from the first war, but that not my soul. Maybe war is the strongest narcotic in the world. As I read his words, I see more and more similarities, and I see more and more the damage that we've done to ourselves and to each other as we've put people in these conditions, men and women, in these conditions of constant warfare. The second war was quite different from the first. For Chechnya, the first war had been a war of liberation, a war for independence, when the people were united and inspired. In the second, it was not the Chechens we fought, but the rebel bands. By then, the Chechens were tired of lawlessness and dislocation. The second war was even more incomprehensible and dirty than the first. I did not mean to write a book. I did not even think about what it was I was writing, stories, memoirs of some other kind of text. It was not consciously a project. I just couldn't carry war within myself any longer. I needed to speak my mind, to squeeze the war out of my system. I wrote compulsively on my way to work in the metro, during my journalistic assignments at home at night, and some of the stories almost wrote themselves. Many of them were hard going, and I had to force myself to write them. But I was not writing a book. I was simply continuing those unfinished discussions with the boys. They stayed with me long after the war was over, and I could not let them go. It was a form of madness. This book is largely an autobiography. Everything in it is true. A few stories have been compiled from several real episodes that have been compressed into a single period and shifted in time. Some events I did not witness personally, but I can vouch for their veracity. All of the characters are real people. The names are real too, but in a few cases, I have combined 2 or 3 persons into one character. I don't know why. Perhaps it was easier for me to write that way. In the end, it all added up to the book. Let that war remain in people's memories. It must not be forgotten. That was the preface to the book, and now I'm going to read to you a section here that's called Mozdok 7. It describes the daily life of these conscripted Russian soldiers. Strictly speaking, there is no dedovshchina, bullying, in our regiment. Dedovshchina is a set of unofficial rules, a kind of code of laws, which, if violated, incur corporal punishment. For example, your walk. Your walk is determined by the amount of time you have served. The spirits, those who have just been called up, are not supposed to walk at all. They are supposed to flit or rustle. Those in their second 6 months The skulls or bishops are entitled to a more relaxed mode of walking, but their gait is nonetheless supposed to reflect humility. Only the lords who are about to be demobilized can walk with a special swagger that is allowed only to the older recruits, a leisurely pace, their heels scraping the floor. If I had even thought about walking like that in training, I'd immediately have been showered with punches. Up for demob now, are you? They'd have asked, and then they'd have given me hell. If I stuck my hands in my pockets, it'd also get a thump on the head. That is the privilege of the older soldiers. A spirit should forget about his pockets entirely. Otherwise, they fill them with sand and sew them up. The sand chafes the groin, and 2 days later, you have weeping sores. You can get a beating for anything at all. If a spirit doesn't show respect in his conversation with an older soldier, a granddad, he'll get beaten up. If he talks too loudly or goes about the barracks clattering his heels, he'll get beaten up. If he lies in his bed in the day, he'll get beaten up. If the people back home send him good rubber slippers that he decides to wear them in the shower, he'll get beaten up and lose the slippers. And if a spirit ever thinks of turning down the tops of his boots or walking around with his top button undone, or if his cap is tipped back on his head or to one side, or he doesn't do his belt up tightly enough, they'll thrash him so hard he'll forget his name. He is a spirit, the lowest dregs, and it's his job to slave until the other older soldiers have been discharged. But at the same time, the older soldiers jealously guard their rights over their spirits. Every self-respecting granddad has his own spirit, a personal slave, and only he is allowed to beat and punish him. If someone else starts to harass this spirit, then he'll go straight to the granddad, and then there are conflicts. You'll be bugging him, so you're bugging me. It's also good for a spirit to have his personal granddad. First of all, only one person beats you. Then you can always complain to him if someone else makes claims on you, and he'll go and sort it out. If a skull, a soldier in his second 6 months, thumps a spirit's head or takes money from him, then he'll get a good sound beating. Only granddads are allowed to rob the young ones. A spirit is obliged to rustle up money, cigarettes, and food only for his own granddad, and he can ignore anyone else's demands. The only exception is a granddad who's stronger than yours. You can see this whole gang-like hierarchy exists within the soldiers' unit, and it's not. And there were things like this going on within the United States Army too. In our barracks, if we had a soldier who couldn't keep up and was bringing down all kinds of demerits and punishments on the rest of us, we would have a blanket party for that person. And what we would do at night is we would put bars of soap in socks. We would throw a blanket over the individual and hold him down in his bed and beat him with the bars of soap. This was to teach him to not fall back in formation, to not steal, to not go to sleep on fire watch. I find this incredible amount of similarity between the way the Soviets treated their own soldiers, the Russian army, and the way we treat our own men within our army. There's a whole hierarchy of order within the unit. It's essentially an armed gang. And there's a hierarchy within that gang that lets you do certain things, lets you acquire certain things, and as the longer you're in service, like these spirits and skulls and granddads, the more privileges you seem to acquire. Everybody beats everyone. The D-mobs, the Dembels with 3 months of service to go, the officers, the warrant officers, they get stinking drunk and then hammer the ones below them. Even the colonels beat the majors. The majors beat the lieutenants, and they all beat the privates. And granddads beat the new recruits. No one talks to each other like human beings. They just smack each other in the mouth. Because it's easier that way, quicker and simpler to understand. I found this book very difficult to go through at times, but I found it extremely illustrative of exactly what war does to human beings when they're there. I would recommend that you read this book if you want to find out what it's like to be in someone else's army and what they go through. These are voices of veterans from all over the world. This is the book I've read parts from before. It's called Sergeant Back Again. It was written by a combat veteran of Vietnam, Charles Coleman, who lives in West Hartford, actually, and was a combat medic in Vietnam in 1968, 2 years before I was there. This is a little story that he tells in the book, and I'm going to read this for us here. There's two people sitting in a bar, and Collins, the medic, is sitting in the bar, and two officers walk in to get a drink. The captain orders another scotch and pays extra for a separate glass filled with ice. Pieces of dirt settle to the bottom as the ice melts. The edge of a thin air letter hangs limply out of his breast pocket like soggy toilet paper. He fingers the letter. Collins is listening to them. And then to the piano melody again, the only thing to cool off with. The heat is intense. The captain orders another round of drinks. 2 more glasses of ice on the side. 800 piastres across the bar. The ice costs as much as the drinks. A fat fly buzzes overhead and then lands on the shrinking pile of ice. He takes off before the captain's hand covers the glass to trap and then drown him. The Dai asks the American, the Dai is the Vietnamese officer, about the testimony on Allerton. The piano music stops, and then a light, unimpassioned applause as the intermission at Café de l'Orange. You know him before then, asked the Dai. Yeah, we were in ROTC together in college in Missouri. We came over at the same time, ended up in the same battalion, even in the same company. I was best man at his wedding. What did really happen, asked the Dai. Pretty much what you heard, Lo Chan, except it was a premeditated thing. There's a technicality there. Was he together or not? Did he my tree, as you would say? The fly inches across the bar in the direction of the American captain. He notices it coming closer. Before you and your strikers rendezvoused with us, Allerton and I were walking the perimeter. We wandered off toward the river to watch the sunset. Beautiful setting in that light, soft and quiet, with a mist steaming up off the water. When we came out of the thickets along the river, there was this young chick taking off her clothes to bathe. There was something unusual. It was the light, I think. I mean, you could feel it through your skin, warm, serene. It made you kind of forget where you were and what was going on. We grinned at each other for a second and shook our heads. You pay a lot of dough back in the States for a vacation in such a place. Anyway, continues the captain, she strips naked at the water's edge. The sun has just sunk beneath the trees. She was pretty, in her late teens, I guess, and she stood on the bank for a while watching the river. What was that river, Lo Chong? The Song Ba, yeah. Then Allerton hands me his rifle, shrugs his shoulders, and says, why not? Walks over towards the girl. I was going to stop him, but somehow it didn't seem to matter much. It was his affair. I sat down against a tree and checked his clip. It was about half expended, so I popped in a fresh load. We weren't very well secured here, as you remember. It was risky business all the way around. Very risky. We knew Charlie was around, but we hadn't gotten a fix on him. The fly keeps cautiously within range of the captain now. He has a swizzle stick in his hand. Without even being aware of it, he nails that fly, that fat, pesky fly, with a snap of the stick on the bar. The carcass just lies there in front of his drink until he begins playing with it, pushing it an inch this way and an inch that way. The fly is still alive, revived by the prodding of the stick. He plants it on the fly's body. He severs one wing, then sweeps it off to the right, towards Collins. The next thing I heard was Allerton screaming at the top of his lungs. He made a weird sound. His voice came back in a long scream. Jesus Christ, what the hell's going on? What the hell? I jumped to my feet and ran toward him. He was screaming and shouting. The other ring slides off the left,